Salt Creek Prairie, Texas. May 18, 1871. A stormy afternoon. Clouds thickening over the low limestone hills. The Butterfield Overland Road runs west through the scrub of Young County, cutting across a stretch of open ground where the north branch of Flint Creek bends near a rise locals called the Salt Creek Crossing. 12 wagons drawn by mule teams are strung out along that road, hauling corn and fodder to the frontier forts to the west. The men on those wagons are teamsters, working men, hired hands of a civilian freighting contractor named Henry Warren. They carry no particular cargo worth dying for. Just grain, army rations, the ordinary commerce of a garrison frontier. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What they do not know is that they have been watched for hours. Behind a long hill running parallel to the road, crouched in the scrub timber, are somewhere between 150 and 180 Kiowa warriors. They have been there since morning. They watched General William Tecumseh Sherman's inspection party pass by on this same road hours earlier, and they let it go. The night before, their medicine man, a man named Mamanti, whom the Kiowa called the Owl Prophet, told them to wait. He said a richer target was coming. So they waited, in silence, in the brush, through the building clouds and the restless hours of a May afternoon. 150 warriors lay still as stones while the most famous soldier in America rode past within rifle range. And not one of them moved. That patience, that discipline, that refusal to be drawn into a fight they hadn't chosen, is the first thing you need to understand about the Kiowa. They did not strike the way the movies say they did. They did not come screaming over hills in the open sunlight. They came the way a shadow falls. You did not hear them. You did not see them. You felt them. When the Warren Wagon Train came into view in the early afternoon, Mamanti gave the signal. The Kiowa have one of the longest migration stories on the continent. Their origins are in what is today western Montana, possibly farther north, and they are believed to have been a mountain people before they were a plains people. At some point in the 17th century, they began moving south and east, guided in part by their early alliance with the Crow Nation, who taught them the ways of the open grasslands, the horse, and the buffalo hunt. By the late 18th century, the Kiowa had settled into the region of the Black Hills, where they fought persistently with the Cheyenne and the Sioux. A devastating smallpox epidemic in 1781 killed close to 2,000 Kiowa, perhaps half the tribe, and in the aftermath they made the decision to pull south out of the Black Hills entirely and migrate toward the southern plains. That decision changed everything. On the southern plains, the Kiowa encountered the Comanche, the most formidable equestrian nation in North America. A collision between the two peoples was expected. Instead, sometime around 1790, peace was made. The two nations formed an alliance that would define the southern plains for nearly a century. They shared hunting grounds. They raided together. They fought side by side against the Spanish, against the Mexicans, against the Texans, and against the United States Army. Together, the Kiowa and Comanche, along with their Apache allies, created a zone of control across what is now western Texas, eastern New Mexico, and southwestern Oklahoma that four different colonial and national powers never fully managed to penetrate. The Kiowa also made peace with the Cheyenne and Arapaho around 1840, a council held at Bent's Ford on the Arkansas River, brokered in part by the fur trader William Bent, whose wife was a Cheyenne woman. The result was a coalition of 5 nations that effectively blocked passage across the southern plains. The U.S. government sent the 1st Dragoons to protect wagon trains on the Santa Fe Trail. It was not enough. The Kiowa were not a large tribe. At their peak in the mid-19th century, they probably numbered somewhere around 3,000 people. But size was not the point. What the Kiowa had was mobility, tactical discipline, and a culture that produced warriors of extraordinary skill. Every young man in Kiowa society earned his social standing through war honors. There were 4 principal honors: killing an enemy, taking a bow or shield from an enemy in close combat, striking an enemy in battle, and capturing a horse. Rank within the warrior societies that structured Kiowa military life was earned through the accumulation of these deeds. Leadership followed. A man with no war honors was a man with no standing. They acquired horses from the Spanish, who had introduced them into the Americas, and they mastered cavalry tactics in a way that shocked and confounded every military force they encountered. A Kiowa warrior on horseback could fire arrows with accuracy while hanging off the side of his horse, using the animal's body as a shield. He could control his mount with his legs alone, freeing both hands for weapons. He could cross 200 miles in 3 days and leave no trail a pursuing column of infantry could follow. They could appear from nowhere and be gone in minutes, leaving devastation behind them and no direction of pursuit. Settlers on the Texas frontier understood one thing about the Kiowa and the Comanche that the newspapers back east did not seem to grasp. The full moon was something to fear. Raiding parties moved at night, by moonlight, and the full moon of the autumn months, when visibility was highest, and the grass was cured enough to sustain horses on long drives, was the season when raids came most reliably. Settlers along the Texas frontier line called it the Comanche Moon, though the Kiowa rode under it just as often. Farms were abandoned. Families that couldn't move to town barricaded their doors. Children were brought inside before dark. The raids came anyway, silently, out of the dark. To understand how the Kiowa reached the Salt Creek Prairie in the spring of 1871, you have to understand the decade that preceded it. In October 1867, at Medicine Lodge Creek in Kansas, a massive council was held between the United States government and the principal nations of the Southern Plains, including the Kiowa. The Medicine Lodge Treaty was the government's attempt to settle the land question that had been festering since Texas joined the Union in 1845 and exploding since the end of the Civil War, when a wave of Anglo-American settlement pushed hard into territory that had been Kiowa and Comanche hunting ground for generations. The treaty offered a reservation in southwestern Oklahoma between the Washita and Red Rivers, with guarantees of annuity payments, rations, and tools for farming. In exchange, the Kiowa agreed to stop raiding and to confine their movements to the reservation lands. The Kiowa signed. Satanta signed, and so did Satank and others. They took the annuities. And then they kept raiding, because the alternative was starvation. The buffalo herds that sustained Kiowa life were being destroyed from the outside in. Commercial hunters, many of them operating with the implicit blessing of the U.S. Army, were moving onto the southern plains and killing bison by the tens of thousands. The hide trade was worth real money in eastern markets. The bones went to fertilizer plants. The meat was largely left to rot. By the late 1860s, the southern herd, which had stretched across hundreds of thousands of square miles, was visibly contracting. The Kiowa could see it. They could count it. They could feel it in the diminishing returns of every hunt. For a people whose entire material culture, food supply, and spiritual life was organized around the buffalo, the destruction of the herd was not an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. The sun dance, the central religious ceremony of the Kiowa year, required a buffalo kill. The construction of winter robes and lodges required buffalo hides. The feast foods that marked every celebration, every morning, every ceremony of Kiowa life were buffalo. Without the buffalo, the Kiowa could not be the Kiowa. The reservation offered a substitute: government rations, issued periodically at the Indian Agency at Fort Sill, doled out with delays and shortfalls, and outright corruption in the supply chain that left families genuinely hungry in the months when the next delivery was late. The farming the government proposed as an alternative to hunting was something Kiowa men considered incompatible with who they were. Farming was not warfare. Farming was not raiding. Farming produced no war honors. So the young men rode south across the Red River into Texas, where the buffalo still ran in reduced but present numbers, where cattle ranches could be raided for horses and cattle, and where the settlers who had moved onto Kiowa territory could be struck in payment for everything that was being taken from them. The principal chief of all the Kiowa bands, a man named Dohason, had held the tribe together for more than 3 decades through force of personality and shrewd management of the politics between the reservation and the raiding world. When Dohason died in 1866, no one had the authority to fill that space. What followed was a period of intense competition among several powerful subchiefs, each commanding his own following, each pushing his own policy. Among them were Gapago, known to the Americans as Lone Wolf; Tinangopti, called Kicking Bird, who argued for accommodation with the United States; and Satanta, set-named in Kiowa, White Bear, the man who would become the most famous Kiowa chief in American history, and the one most Americans would blame for everything that happened at Salt Creek Prairie in the spring of 1871. He was, by most accounts, an extraordinary person. Born around 1820, probably along the Canadian River, Satanta was the son of Chief Red Teepee, who served as keeper of the tribe's sacred medicine bundles, the Taimee. He grew up in a family with direct connection to the spiritual center of Kiowa life, and he came of age during the peak years of Kiowa power, when the alliance with the Comanche was secure and the southern plains were still theirs. He developed a reputation as a fighter while still young and was made a sub-chief under Dohason in his 20s. By middle age, he was the kind of man other men watched when he entered a room. Tall, physically imposing, with what observers described as an erect bearing and a piercing glance. He spoke 4 native languages and Spanish. At the Medicine Lodge Council in 1867, he gave speeches that Army officers and government commissioners found compelling despite themselves, and the Americans gave him the nickname he carried for the rest of his life, the Orator of the Plains. He was also, by the historical record, a man who raided, who killed, and who understood that the choices before his people had no good options. He signed treaties he knew were inadequate. He argued in council for his people's survival, and when the alternatives failed him, he wrote. But here is what the history books usually get wrong. Satanta was not the real architect of the Salt Creek Prairie ambush. The man who planned it, who guided the raid party with his knowledge of the country and his hold over the young warriors, was someone else entirely. His name was Mamanti, Mamanti in Kiowa, meaning roughly he who walks above, sometimes translated as Skywalker. He was a war chief and a medicine man simultaneously, a combination of roles that gave him unusual power in Kiowa society. After Dohason's death, while the prominent chiefs competed for political authority, Mamanti built a different kind of influence, spiritual authority. He claimed access to messages from the owl, a bird the Kiowa associated with death and the spirit world. He carried a cured owl skin that he used in his divinations, manipulating it like a hand puppet while in spiritual communication. He told warriors what raids would succeed and which would fail. He told them when to go and when to wait. The old Kiowa accounts of the 1871 raid are consistent on one point. Ask who led the great raid in which the Teamsters were killed, and the answer was always Mamanti, not Satanta. Mamanti was the one who identified the Salt Creek crossing as an ambush point. Mamanti was the one who told his warriors the night before the attack that a small party would come first and they should let it pass, because a richer target would follow. And when General Sherman's inspection retinue of 18 men came down the Butterfield Road the next morning, 150 warriors crouched in the brush and watched him go. That restraint is something historians have puzzled over ever since. 150 warriors against 18 soldiers. A ratio of more than 8-to-1. The most famous military commander in the United States, the man who had burned Atlanta, the man who was at that precise moment traveling through Texas on an inspection tour to determine whether the frontier violence was as bad as the settlers claimed, riding within rifle range of a Kiowa war party that could have ended him without difficulty. They let him pass. Whether they knew who he was is uncertain. Mamanti's prophecy had told them to wait. They waited. 3 hours later, the Warren Wagon Train appeared. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The attack was swift, organized, and overwhelming. The 12 wagons were strung out along the road, moving in the measured pace of mule-drawn freight wagons loaded with government corn. The Teamsters had no particular reason to be afraid. They were on a road they knew, hauling a routine cargo to forts they serviced regularly. When the Kiowa came over and around the hill, the wagon drivers did what the frontier manuals recommended. They formed the wagons into a circle and drove the mules into the center. It was a defensive posture designed to create a perimeter and deny the attackers clear shots at the livestock. The teamsters carried weapons. They fired them. According to the accounts of the 5 men who survived, the fight was violent and one-sided. The Kiowa outnumbered them more than 12-1. The wagon circle gave the defenders a perimeter, but no real protection. 7 of the 12 teamsters were killed. Their bodies were mutilated in the manner of plains warfare, a practice intended to dishonor enemies and deny them passage to the spirit world in the beliefs of several plains cultures. 40 mules were taken, loaded with whatever supplies could be carried. The corn was destroyed. 3 Kiowa warriors died in the attack, according to most accounts. 5 teamsters escaped into the brush and eventually made their way to Fort Richardson. One of them, a man named Thomas Braziel, walked 20 miles on foot to reach the fort. When he got there and told his story to Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, Mackenzie sent word to Sherman, who was still traveling east after his inspection tour, and reached Fort Richardson the following morning. Sherman had ridden past the ambush site less than 3 hours before his own escort soldiers' colleagues were killed there. He had personally dismissed the Texas settlers' reports of Kiowa violence as exaggerated. He had traveled through the region with a small party, and nothing had happened to him. He arrived at Fort Richardson and was greeted by survivors who told him what had happened 3 hours after he passed the same spot. The general's position changed. Sherman ordered Mackenzie to pursue and apprehend the leaders of the raid. He sent orders to Lori Tatum, the Quaker Indian agent at the Kiowa Comanche Reservation at Fort Sill, to watch for the return of any warriors who matched the description of the raiders. A few days later, Satanta came to the agency to request supplies and ammunition, and in the manner of a man who cannot resist the telling of a good story, he told Tatum that he had led the war party that killed the teamsters at Salt Creek. He said Satank had been there. He said Big Tree had been there. He said the warriors could have killed Sherman if they had wanted to. Tatum wrote a letter to Sherman. The arrests of Satanta, Satank, and Big Tree at Fort Sill, on the porch of the agent's office in the presence of Sherman himself and a company of cavalry, was one of the most dramatic scenes in the history of the Southern Plains Wars. Satanta walked out of the meeting onto the porch, saw the soldiers, and understood immediately what was happening. He reached for his rifle. The soldiers raised their weapons. He was taken without gunfire. Satank was a different matter entirely. He was an elderly man by 1871, somewhere in his 70s, and he had spent the preceding year in grief. His son, also named Satank, had been killed in a Texas raid in 1870, and the old man had gone to Texas himself to retrieve his son's bones, which he carried with him ever afterward wrapped in a blanket on the back of a horse he led wherever he went. He was a man who had decided that his life was already behind him. When the soldiers loaded him into a wagon for transport to Jacksboro for trial, he began to sing his death song. He told the other prisoners he would not leave Kiowa territory alive. He worked one hand free of his wrist shackles by stripping the skin from his own hand against the metal. He pulled a knife he had concealed and stabbed one of the guards. The soldiers shot him. He was killed in what is now Comanche County, Oklahoma, on the road between Fort Sill and Texas, as he had said he would be. Satanta and Big Tree were transported to Jacksboro, Texas, where they stood trial in a civilian court. The trial was the first time in American history that Native American chiefs were tried for murder in a state court. The jury deliberated for a short time before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced both men to hang. The sentences were never carried out. Governor Edmund Davis, under pressure from advocates of the federal peace policy and from Quaker groups who argued that hanging the chiefs would trigger a general war on the Southern Plains, commuted the sentences to life imprisonment. Satanta and Big Tree were sent to the state penitentiary at Huntsville. In 1873, over Sherman's explicit objection, they were paroled as a gesture toward peace with the Kiowa. Sherman was furious. He wrote that releasing them was a fatal mistake and that both men would raid again. He was right. Satanta was back at the reservation within months. By 1874, with the Kiowa and Comanche and Cheyenne refusing to accept the annihilation of the buffalo herds and the final confinement to reservation life, a general uprising began across the southern plains. Warriors from multiple nations left the reservations and gathered on the staked plains of the Texas Panhandle. The Red River War of 1874 and 1875 was the last major military confrontation between the United States Army and the Southern Plains nations. It ended with Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's destruction of the Kiowa and Comanche horse herds at Palo Duro Canyon in September of 1874. Mackenzie's men did not kill large numbers of warriors in that fight. They killed the horses, more than 1,000 of them. Without horses, the Kiowa and Comanche could not hunt, could not travel, could not fight, could not survive the approaching winter on the open plains. The destruction of the horses was the destruction of the Kiowa way of life in a single afternoon. The bands surrendered through the winter of 1874 and into 1875. The warriors considered most dangerous were transported to Fort Marion in Florida, including Mamanti, the Owl Prophet, who died there in July 1875, probably of illness. Kiowa tradition holds that he brought his death on himself by using his medicine against one of his own people, a taboo in Kiowa spiritual belief. The consequences of that violation, they said, were his death. Satanta was rearrested in the fall of 1874 and returned to the Huntsville Penitentiary. He died there in October 1878. The historical record says he threw himself from an upper-story window of the prison hospital. He was somewhere between 60 and 63 years old. His body was initially buried in the prison cemetery, and it remained there for decades before his family was finally permitted to bring him home to Oklahoma in 1963. He was reburied at Fort Sill, near the graves of Quanah Parker and Geronimo. Now here is the thing: the popular history almost always gets backward when it tells the story of the Warren Wagon Train Raid and the Kiowa Wars of the 1870s. The standard version frames Satanta and the Kiowa as the aggressors, as raiders and killers operating outside the law, bringing violence to a peaceful frontier. And the violence was real. 7 men died on the Salt Creek Prairie. The testimony of the survivors describes something brutal and methodical. That is documented history, and it deserves to be said plainly. But the context that surrounds that violence is just as real, and it is just as documented. The Medicine Lodge Treaty that the Kiowa signed in 1867 promised them protection from the commercial buffalo hunters who were destroying their food supply. That protection was never provided. The annuity rations the treaty guaranteed were delivered late, short, and often spoiled. The land the treaty acknowledged as Kiowa territory was being crossed and settled by Anglo-American ranchers and buffalo hunters who were not subject to any meaningful legal restraint. The army that was supposed to enforce the treaty's provisions was the same army sending inspection tours to evaluate whether the Indian violence the settlers complained about was real. By 1871, the Kiowa were watching their world end at a speed that no treaty adjustment or political appeal had slowed. The buffalo were going. The land was going. The young men who rode with Mamanti and Satanta to Salt Creek Prairie were not doing something random. They were doing what their culture had always done in response to threat, and they were doing it against people they understood to be the agents of everything being taken from them. This does not make 7 dead Teamsters any less dead. It makes the history more honest about what was actually happening on the Southern Plains in 1871 and why. The Texas frontier of the 1860s and 1870s existed in a state of terror that most people in eastern cities and in Washington simply did not believe until Sherman rode through it himself and nearly didn't come back. Settlers in the outer counties of North and West Texas had been living for years with the knowledge that a full moon meant danger, that a farm too far from a neighbor might not survive the night, that the silence between sound and sound on an open prairie could mean that something was already watching you. The Kiowa did not make noise when they came. That was part of what made them so hard to defend against and so terrifying to the people they raided. A plains warrior on horseback, moving through tall grass in the hour before dawn, was not visible, was not audible. He was a shape in the dark that became, very suddenly, something right next to you. Army patrols that arrived at the scene of a raid found the dead and the disturbed ground and the direction the tracks went. By the time they arrived, the war party was 30 miles away. By the time they followed the tracks to the Red River, the warriors were across it and gone. 3,000 soldiers were stationed on the Texas frontier at various points in the late 1860s and early 1870s. They patrolled millions of acres of broken country. The Kiowa moved through that country on routes and at times of their own choosing. For a decade, it was not a fair contest. The Warren Wagon Train Raid, the trial at Jacksboro, the parole and the rearrest, the Red River War, and Palo Duro Canyon. All of it fell into place between 1871 and 1875. For years that ended a way of life that had existed for generations. The Kiowa called the period after the Red River War the time when everything changed. The sun dance, which required a buffalo, became impossible to hold in the traditional form after the herds were gone. The last Kiowa sun dance held in the old way, with a real buffalo tongue as the sacred object of the ceremony, took place in 1887. After that, the ceremony changed to accommodate what was available, because the buffalo were not. The Kiowa name for themselves is Kayigwu, meaning roughly the principal people. They came south out of the mountains with almost nothing and built an alliance that controlled the southern plains for nearly a century. They fought every military and colonial force that tried to move through their territory. They signed treaties and watched those treaties be undone by the pressure of expansion that no treaty was ever really designed to stop. They used the only leverage they had, which was their ability to make the southern plains dangerous. And when that leverage was finally broken, it was broken not by military defeat in any conventional sense, but by the methodical destruction of the thing the plains itself depended on. You cannot fight a cavalry column with horses you no longer have. You cannot feed your children with a herd that is no longer there. The men who rode with Mamanti to Salt Creek Prairie on the morning of May 18, 1871, and crouched in the brush and let the most powerful general in America ride past, and then rose from the earth like smoke when the wagons came around the bend, were the last generation of Kiowa warriors who lived the life that life had always been. Their sons grew up on the reservation. Their grandsons wore different clothes and went to government schools and were told to forget. Some of them forgot. Some of them didn't. The Kiowa Gourd Clan and the Black Leggings Warrior Society still hold their dances in Oklahoma. The warrior spirit that Satanta and Satank and Mamanti embodied, the thing that made an army officer and a government commissioner and an orator's enemy all use the same word, fierce, to describe the same man. That thing survived reservation policy and assimilation pressure and everything the 20th century brought with it. N. Scott Momaday, the Kiowa author who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1969 for his novel House Made of Dawn, wrote about the moment his grandmother described the last sun dance before the buffalo were gone. He wrote about what it meant to carry a history like that, to know what had been and what it became, to hold it. The Kiowa are still here. That is the part of this story the movies almost never tell. Satanta died in a prison in Texas, far from the Canadian River where he was born, far from the Buffalo Ranges where he became the man his people remembered. The epitaph the historical record gives him is the title the Americans gave him at Medicine Lodge, the Orator of the Plains. Not the warrior, not the chief, the speaker, the man who could say what his people felt and make even his enemies hear it. There is a version of this story that ends with the Salt Creek Prairie and 7 men dead and justice served at a courthouse in Jacksboro. That version is incomplete. The complete version runs from the mountains of Montana to the southern plains, through the smallpox epidemic of 1781 and the peace with the Comanche and the treaties that were signed and undone and signed again, through a full moon rising over North Texas and a line of warriors moving silent through the grass, through a court in Jacksboro where 2 chiefs sat in chairs no chief had ever sat in before and heard a sentence that the governor would not let stand, through a canyon in the Texas Panhandle where 1,000 horses were shot, through a prison window in Huntsville on an October morning in 1878. It runs through all of that and comes out the other side still going. Remember the names. Satanta, Setiained, White Bear, Chief, Warrior, Orator of the Plains, Satank, Satangia, Sitting Bear, whose death song they heard for miles. Mamanti, he who walks above. who read the sky and told his warriors to wait, and they did, and a general rode past, and they let him go. Big Tree, a Duite, who lived long enough to become a deacon in a Baptist church in Oklahoma, and who was there at the beginning of the end, and who carried it. And the 7 men buried in Young County, Texas, at Salt Creek Crossing: Nathan S. Long, N. J. Baxter, Jesse Bowman, Samuel Elliott, James Williams, John Mullins, and Thomas Brazil, who walked out of it. Their names are on a marker in a field in Texas. They were freighters, working men, hired to carry grain to forts in the country that was someone else's before it was theirs. All of them are part of the same story. None of them were the last thing in it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.